All right. Welcome again to another stream and another continued reading of American Negro Slave Revolts. This is chapter 4, and we're going to deal with section 1. Chapter 4, Some Participants of Rebellion. This is going to be a very interesting chapter. Despite the existence of the erratic machine for exploitation, the direct victims of it is the Negro slave persistently resisting its creation or creator, and occasionally receive assistance from the less direct victims, the poor whites. What were the factors that implied the slaves towards their militant behavior? Which is a good question. Frederick Law Amist correctly remarked that any great event having the slightest bearing upon the question of emancipation is known to produce as unwholesome excitement among the slave population. It is, moreover, a fact that on numerous occasions, unusually or striking events having no apparent connection with slavery, were interrupted by the Negroes as though the correction was present, and that this played a part in participating some plots and uprisings. Thus, the arrival of Governor Alexander Spotswood in Virginia in 1730 set the slaves whispering that he had brought from the king an order to set all those slaves free that were Christian, and to free those who became Christian, but that their master had suppressed this, while at first no discovery could be made of any form design of their rising, but merely unlawful meetings and loose disclosures, and these were soon stopped by keeping the militants to their duties by imprisonment and severe whippings of the most suspect within 6 weeks. An actual conspiracy was uncovered. This centered in Norfolk and Princess Anna counties and had reached the point where on a Sunday whistles the people were at church. Some 200 slaves gathered and proceeded to. Okay, and there's a little subsection on here that you can read once you get the book personally. Item crew choose from among themselves officers to command their intent insurrection. This time imprisonment and lashing were brought to be insufficient stimulant to docility, and 4 of the leaders were executed. Thereafter, it was provided that white men who went to worship the Prince of Peace were to take their guns with them. Similarly, some hundreds of slaves of East Jersey near Somerville planned a rebellion and fought to nearby Indians in 1734, and one of the considerations moving them was a belief that the king had issued orders freeing them, but that these had been kept secretly by their owners. One Negro belonging to a Mr. Hall, who appeared to have had a drink too many, could not resist under such exhilarating exhilarating circumstance. The pleasure of telling a white man of the above fact that his further believed that Englishmen were generally a pack of villains, and that he, the slave, was as good a man as himself, and that in a little time he should be convinced of it. Complete details of the plot were soon uncovered. Many slaves were arrested, and some of whom were found qualities of poison. Some were whipped, others had their ears cut off, and 2 were condemned to hanging, though one of them, and actually, though since one, he of the loquacious moods escaped the gallows claim, but one Negro note had already been taken of Governor Dinwiddie remarks in July 1755 that the slaves of Virginia learned of the French victories over the British were becoming very audacious, since that they believed that the former would give them their freedom. And the bitter and prolonged congressional debates concerned the admissions of Missouri into the Union, and the course of which men like King and Talmadge expressed opposition to slavery, somehow reached the ears of certain of the slaves involved in the Great Vesey Conspiracy of 1822 in South Carolina, but it reached their ears in exaggerating form, or as it perhaps more likely they put into what they heard that which they wished to believe. In the way they became convinced that Congress had not merely heard speeches demonstratory or democratory of slavery, but had actually passed an act of emancipation, but which their master refused to abide. Mention of this is made in the official report of the trial of the rebel Negro, and it is also remarked upon by Joel R. Poinsett, who was in Charleston at the time, and declared the decision of Missouri question at Washington, among other evil, produced this plot. It was considered by the unfortunate and half-instructed people as one of emancipation. In the winter of 1825, a slave plot was uncovered and crashed in Edgecombe, and it is believed some of the adjacent counties in North Carolina slave preachers were blamed, and it was stated they had told the Negroes that the national government had set them free in October, and that they were being unjustified held in servitude. There was more bias for the belief in the intimacy of freedom that moved slaves in Texas and disrupt their master in 1828 for the Constitution of the State of Calamula, Texas, of March of 1827 declared that no one was thereafter to be born a slave and outlaw. After 6 months, the introduction of any more slaves, a law, however, of May of 1828 recognized the legality of contracts made between master and worker prior to arrival in Texas, so that by the use of lifetime contracts, slavery for all practical purpose was legalized. Yet the slave felt that the government had indeed freed them, and they became very difficult and restless under the yoke. The owner had their own imitable methods of driving concern over legal questions from the minds of their chattels, so that, according to a contemporary investigation, they, in the efforts to retain them, are making that yoke even heavier. They enact their teeth set on the dogs to tear them to pieces, the most lieutenant being he who that flog his slave until they are flayed. Wow. And widespread unrest was characterized of the slave in the South in 1829. One of the factors moving the Negroes of Virginia was their belief that the recent election of delegates to their constitutional convention to the held in 1829 and 30 of 1829 and 1830, was for the purpose of deciding the question of their emancipation. Some had decided to rebel unless that decision were in their favor. According to the magistrate of police in Wilmington, North Carolina, unrest and plots among Negroes of the neighborhoods in the summer of 1830 were attributable not merely to the circulation among them of David Walker seditious pamphlet, and there's a little undertone writing over here, which y'all can go for yourself. In addition, the magistrative report that a very general and extensive impression has been made on the mind of the Negroes in this vicinity, that measures have been taken towards their emancipation on a certain and not disdained day. Again, one of the considerations striving slaves of Elizabeth City in the same state in 1835 was the belief shared by the Negroes that the Liberators was on his way from the North and to lead them to the struggling for freedom. The tremendous fanfare of the Templeton and Tyler II campaign of 1840, or it's called Templemore, with each side denouncing the other as abolitionists or the abolitionists, and trying to their alleged devotion to liberty develop dangerous illusions amongst the slaves of Perry County, Alabama. Many believed that they were to be free. One maintained that Van Buren was the region of Montgomery with an army of liberations totaling 200,000 men, while another felt that deliverance would come through the hands of the British forces. Negroes told each other at their hush meetings that the coming of freedom, and there's a French joke here which I'm not going to go into. And with dogs, everybody is guave to be free, or guave to be free, and the white man or the white masses of genuine to pay them for their works. O my brethren, they press time knocking at their door. Old English, for a better lack of saying. More frequently, patrolling, arrests, and lashings were needed to convince the slave that they were wrong when they shout, "The year of Jubilee is coming. We all are genuine to be free." A letter written from Charles Valley, Georgia, February the 2nd, 1844, contains the interesting remarks that the Negroes in Georgia are already saying to each other, "The great men are trying to set them free and will succeed," and many other expressions of similar importance. Certain it is that one of the inspirations moving slaves in Texas and Tennessee to plot insurrections in 1856 was their belief that the colony Vermont, that Republican presidential candidate, would aid them. A Memphis newspaper report in alluding to widespread evidence of unrest in the city that a lady of a few days ago went into her kitchen and gave some directions to the Negro cooks, who impudently replied with a smirk or a sneer, "When Vermont elect, you will have a slung them pot yourself." This hopes gave encouragement to slave convicts of conspiracy in Charles Valley, Tennessee, even while they were serving their punishment. Thus, the contemporary witness remarks, "Certain slaves are greatly abdued with this fable, that I have seen them smile when they were being whipped, and have heard of them saying that Fremont and his men can hear them blow. They received a vigilant commitment in Harrison County, Texas, at the same period reports that there had been a good deal of losing talk among the Negroes about the hate election and the prospect of Fremont's election and the beliefs of some of that they would be free if Fremont was elected. See that? The next campaign led as many by expected to development of similar ideas. Concrete examples of this occurred less frequent than 4 years before, though at least one slave in Georgia followed the success of Abraham Lincoln announced Lincoln was elected now and he was free. Severe whippings was necessary to convince him that his conclusion was rather premature. The presence of Spaniards in Florida who were hostile to the English and befriended their fugitive slave was important in leading Negroes to gamble their lives in uprising and attempt to reach that haven. This condition is well indicated in an unsigned letter dated Carolina, June 24th, 1720, describing a recent, very wicked and hilarious plot of the Negroes rising with a design to destroy all the white people. Most of the rebels were captured and some burnt and hanged and some banished but forgotten, or actually banished. About 14 at first elude arrest those thought to get to. Augustine and hopes that the Greek or the Creek Indians would aid, but the latter would not join them or heed their plots. Another fact mentioned is this letter may also have had some importance in participants of the formation of this scheme. I am to inform you that at the same of Tyrone, the Negroes was playing the rogue. He had a small war with the Victimus, or what we call Vekimus, a nation of Wimmy rivers, not alone 2 men. For many years after the Florida remained a Manitou for American slaves, as well be observed in the course of the narrative. It may here be noted that the slaves who took part in the uprising of Santo, South Carolina, in September 1739, headed for the Edos River, whose mouth is directly north of St. Augustine. Their ultimate goal, contemporaries indeed felt that this insurrection of others that immediate precede and followed it were directly stimulated by agents of Spain, which by 1739 was officially at war with England, but no conclusion evidence of this has been seen. In 1729 and 1730, the regard armed force of the French of Louisiana found it difficult to suppress hostile Indians. Governor Pierre therefore decided to arm adult male slaves and use them against the cockroach. In the later years, however, certain of the Negro being armed became aware of the dependence of the white man upon their assistance and realized that they and the Indian had a common foe, conspired to unite their forces against him. The French learned of the plot in time, and the usual story of lashings on all involved and the execution of the leaders was repeated. Mention had already been made of the signs of unrest notions among slaves in Virginia and Maryland in the years of 1755 and 1756, in the midst of and so contemporaries felt largely because of the derangement of excitement consequent upon the waging of the French and Indian Wars. Much of the same situation prevailed during the years of the American Revolution. Here it is likely that the spirit of philosophy of the movement were important as arousing organized display and discontent amongst the Negroes, as well as the excitement and turmoil characterized welfare, especially revolutionary welfare. Negroes in Boston conspired for liberty in September of 1774, 2 years before America got this actual independence and, create Declaration of Independence 2 years later, 1776. Tried to get the English to help them. They contact an Irishman and got him to write to the governor. Cage offered to fight with him, provided he would arm them, engage liberal them if conquer. If had been said that the governor thought enough of the proposal to call it to the attention and the colony Percy of the Fifth Regime and the details of a Lieutenant Small to look carefully into the matters. The fact that this affair was kept pretty private and that there was little said or written about it to cut off further information, but clearly the strained situation in colonies was important in striving up to the slave. Now, so far as what I'm going into reading, as you know, when they talk about many enactions of revolts, a lot of them were discovered, most likely somebody snitched amongst the population of Negroes that trying to please the oppressor during them days. That's why if you look at most slave revolts that they don't talk about history, if they want to really show clarity of actual history, they don't mention because by telling you that there were many, not just one from Nat Turner and Vesey and them other people, that there were many slave revolts. As you follow the reading, it shows many plots that were taking place, conspired, or anything gathered of Negroes. They were easily squashed, lashed, burned, and executed. Because there are somebody amongst the group of ADOS/black people squealing on their plot and telling their master what's going on. Let's continue. Negroes involved in a considerable plot in North Carolina in 1775 were well acquainted with and apparently moved by the existing political conditions. Thus, they were aware of the fact that a large group of loyalists was presented in the frontier regions. They had planned, after a successful rebellion, to head for the back countries where they were to be received with a number of persons they appointed and armed by the government for their protection. And as a further reward, they were to be settled in a free government of their own. Some uneasiness prevailed in Buck County, Pennsylvania, in July of 1776. That same year when America got their actual independence. Because of the absence of the militants and evidence of slave discontent exemplified in the statement of the Sampson slave of Jeremiah Durgan Jr. that he would burn the house and kill the women and children of the associators when they march out. In the spring of 1778, a slave named Tom, owned by a Mr. Henry Hogan, and in Albany, New York, was jailed because he had attempted to lead false slaves in an effort to obtain freedom, and joined the enemy. Was jailed because he had attempted to lead false slaves in efforts to obtain freedom, and joined the enemy. He was later released, but a warrant for his arrest was again issued, with what results is unknown. In January 1779, for he was endeavoring to stir up the minds of the Negroes against their master. and raised insurrection among them. A slave woman belonging to Hendrik van Schovenhaven betrayed a plot in July of 1780 among a number of Negroes in Albany County, New York, to burn the Half Moon settlement and flee to the British. An effort, apparently unsuccessful, was made to arrest two loyalists, William Lockhart and Frederick Conradin, who were believed to be implicated in the conspiracy against the fairly considerable slave plots of June of 1779 in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, was blamed by the local populace upon the insurgents of Tories, a group of particularly proponents in that community. During the siege of Savannah, Georgia, by a combined American and French force in 1779, the hard-pressed British armed the Negroes and permit them to serve in the ranks, something they willingly did, as they expect freedom to be their reward, and revolutionists were debating or defeated by Governor James Wright, found it difficult matter to disarm and re-enslave the Negroes. Precise detail of these men are lacking, but the trouble certainly at least approached outright rebellions, and it was a difficult matter for the authorities to reduce them to their proper obedience and position. It is highly possible that the outbreaks of the slave revolts in Louisiana in 1795, then owned by Spain, was partially attributed to the war then raging between France and Spain, a conflict that greatly complicated the whole profound of social control of Negroes and whites, since many of the latter of Louisianians were French. The acquisition of Louisiana territory by the United States in 1803 aroused fear that the non-American inhabitants of the area would express their discontent over the charge in sovereignty by enticing slave troubles. This was, for example, expressed December 9th, 1803, in a later date hunted town in Mississippi Territory. Although there is no danger to be apprehended from either government, France or Spain, it is supposed that the Spaniards, such as one opposed to the Americans, taking possession of the country, will be troublesome. As it is expected, they will get the Negroes to join them and doing private injury, but such attempts can soon be stopped. In the summer of 1804, a former officer in the Spanish service, John B.T. Pamphlet, at the moment a planter at Natchitoches, New Orleans Territory, swore before Captain Edward Turner of the United States Army that when recently in the Spanish town of Macarotos, he had seen a crown decree granted freedom and land to all American fugitive slaves. The officer of the governor of Colborne of Orleans were asked to patrol the borders more efficiently, and this was done while pressure was brought upon the Spanish officials to replicate the decree in October of 1804. 9 slaves in Naracatas broke into the planter's house, took lead, powder, and horse, and reached the Spanish territory. Another slave was wounded by the patrol and under questioning implication about 30 more Negroes in similar plans, and declared that 2 whites, 1 Spanish named Marquez, were also involved in slaves elsewhere in Orleans, particularly in Pontu Copa. Then became restless. Patrols were put on the alert, and federal troops who earlier in the year had been moved into the newly enclosed region in large numbers, partially due to the fear of the slave were sent into the town of Nacogdoches itself, and the Spanish soon thereafter revoked the decree. A final piece of evidence of the unrest appeared in the letter written by Governor Calhoun, the mayor of New Orleans, of November the 1st, 1804. Here referenced the made-to-be coming trials of slaves, men and women, and the governor declared that if they were convicted, he would punish them in such a manner, in such a place, as may best serve to terrify those who may be inclined to commit similar enormities. Quite a few conspiracies marked the year of the War of 1812. Probably many of them, it's not all, were invoked, at least in part, because of the existence of the war itself. In only a few cases, however, is there direct evidence of such connection. The possibility that the military activities, and particularly the withdrawal of bodies in arms men from given areas, would be likely to encourage slaves unrest was widely understood and, as has been shown, guarded against in the last Mississippi territories, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, and Louisiana from 1812 to 1815. In addition, two specific instances of unrest were ascribed to the war by contemporaries. One involved the slave of the capital of the British advance towards in its summer of 1813. John Graham note that it's a letter of James Monroe. We have some intimation of proposed insurrection among the blacks in case of the enemy comes up on the source or the score. However, I feel the alarm and the deity or the diary entries of the son of the vice president is more full of the subject. After noting the report proximity of the enemy, young Mr. Gary wrote, and he quotes, "As the militants are ordered off, I expect to patrol more frequently, and this is very necessary, for the blacks in some places refuse to work and say they shall soon be free, and then the white people must look out. One Negro woman went so far as to steal her mistress' keys and refused to return them, saying she would soon pay her for old and new. This was in the city, and the Negro was confined. Should we be attacked, there will be great danger of the black rising, and to prevent this, parole are very necessary to keep them in awe. One other preventive at present is the want of a leader." In the summer of 1814, a free Negro betrays a slave conspiracy in Fredericktown, Maryland. The affair was rumored to be very serious, and great fear prevailed. Because of this, the local newspaper, although it's necessary to notice the affairs and proceedings to minimize it, declaring that but 8 Negroes were in prison and that the seriousness of the matters had been greatly exaggerated. There had been among the slaves, the paper admitted, some talks of arming themselves with knives. That's when a large number of militants was called out. They were to attack the town and had proceeded to nominate a captain and other officers for their companies. The betrayal, however, and the arrest of the leading rebellion effectively removed all danger. The danger, said the paper, and the conclusion by arguing the populace to remain calm. The fighting inciting to the revolts of the Anglo-Americans in Texas against Mexico, and the excitement this produced were important in participating a slave conspiracy there in 1835. The rebellion whites were told that the Mexican aimed to put their slaves free and let them loose upon their families. and the spreading of ideals while creating fear among the slaveholders, no doubtly creates hope and determination among some of their slaves. There is, moreover, evidence of active agitational work of the part of the unnamed free Negroes at this same time. Early in October, it was reported that a force of 2,000 Mexicans were approaching the Brazos River, and 1 week later came the reports the Negroes of Brazos made an attempt to raise Mayor Sutherland came on here, Galau, for a few men to take back. Near 100 had been taken up, many whipped nearly to death, and some hung, etc. R. H. Williams had nearly killed one of his, and there following a most interesting postscript, the Negroes about allude to had divided all the cotton farms, and they intend to ship the cotton to New Orleans and make the white men serve them in turns. During the years of the Mexican War, a few slave plots were reported, but in only one case was a direct connection between that event and a conspiracy note. This occurred in May of 1846 in Pensacola, Florida, or what they call Pensacola, Florida. A letter from that city declared that the slaves had planned to rebel. As soon as a number of the white men went off to war, arrests and great excitement followed. Everybody is armed, and some of the ladies are so frightened that they kept pistols loaded, and since many Negroes were employed at the city navy yard as commanders, commodores, Lattimore, placed in under martial law. Now, mind you, martial law is not something new that people that you see lately that they written into Constitution if needed for us. This has been pushed for decades, actually for centuries. So this is not the first instance that martial law was ever enacted. And this book kind of revealed that. But let's continue on. During the Civil War, there was much disaffection and unrest among the slaves, frequently advanced to the form of conspiracy and rebellion. Unquestionable, the conflict itself, particularly as the anti-slavery mature became more manifest, was the principal importance of bringing about. Again, however, the directed evidence of this relationship is available in only a few cases. Thus, in May of 1861, a Servile conspiracy in which whites were supposed to be implicated was uncovered in Arkansas, or implications. The plot was to have matured on July 4th, and the Negroes had planned, after killing their enslaved, to march up to the river and to meet Mr. Lincoln in December of that year. Numerous houses and barns were burned by Negroes in Henry County, Kentucky, while a new castle of the same states in the same month, about 40 slaves parades the city, singing political songs and shouting for Lincoln, with no one darling to suppress this unique demonstration. Of early in 1862, 17 Negroes, free and slaves, were reported to have been executed in Culpeper County, Virginia. Among them were found copies of the recent issue Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and the plot was believed to be widespread and their existence the greatest consternation imaginable among the whites in that section. A Confederate newspaper is reporting a slave plot in Richmond indicate it believes that it was connected with integrities by the enemy. Under the heading serious charge against a Negro, A typically laconic account followed. A Negro named Bob Richardson, well known in Richmond as a waiter in the saloon, has been committed to Castle Thunder upon the charges of being at the head of the several plots which received its inspirations from the enemy and which was broken in upon a few days ago by the detectives. He will receive his desert rightfully speedfully. At above this time, slaves burnt in considerable portions of Yazoo City, Mississippi, destroyed the courthouse and 14 homes. In nothing this incited, the Mississippi remarks that it was with great difficulty that the Negroes were kept from burning it when the enemy were there before. The coming into permanence of the revolutionary philosophy, or promise, or the occurrence of the mass upheaving were other factors tending to produce slave unrest. The probability that the radicalists occurring during the American Revolutionary played a part in provoking slave plots during that period was already been noted. Certainly, however, the events of the revolutionary nature that had more effects than any other in producing slave unrest within the present borders of the United States was tremendous. Rebellions and prolonged struggles of the Negroes of San Domingo, beginning in the summer of 1791. Concerning the influence, there is considerable evidence. A white man of Richmond, Virginia, who filed a deposition in connections with plots in the state in 1793, report what he had overheard while spying to a group of Negroes. He declared that the one who seems to be the chief speaker said, "You see how the blacks had killed the whites in the French island and took it a while ago." On November 25th of this year, the commanding officer of the militants in Warwick County, Virginia, appealed to the governor for the additional supply of arms and explained his appeal by remarking that since the malicious, or they call melancholy, affairs of Hispaniola and the inhabitants of the lower counties, and especially this country, have been repeatedly armed by some of their slaves, having attempted to rise in insurrections, which was timely suppressed in this country, by executing one of the principal advisors of the insurrection. At the time, slaves brought from the French islands by refugees were themselves directly implicated in terrible. This was intimate in the news items from South Carolina to 1793. They write from Charleston, South Carolina, that the Negroes, in capital letters, have become very isolated, and so much that the citizens are armed and the militants keep constant guard. It is said that the Saint Domingo Negroes have sown the seed of revolt, and that a magazine have been attempted to be broken open. Similar sentiments were voiced from the same city a few years later. Serious and recurrent fires distribute Charleston in the spring of 1796. Arson was suspect, and a group of plunderers was seized as incendiaries, and inhabitants, however, wrote in June of 1796. And it writes, insane. The fresh alarms of the similar nature so often repeat on the next day gave a very serious cast to be continuous of the citizen. Yet, though it was clearly enough that in every instance it was designed, there was a silent observance respecting in which I could not account for. People seemed afraid to inquire into it. Some would whisper their opinions that the Negroes of the place were the author, others that the French Negroes were, and that they certainly intended to make a Santo Domingo business of it. He further told on the arrest of the confessions of some Negroes who implicated whites as Confederates. In November of 1797, 3 slaves were executed and 2 banished for conspiracy to burn the city, and early in 1798, a conspiracy of several French Negroes to fire the city and to act here as they had formerly done at San Domingo was discovered. And I'll read this little passage letter. And it says here, the letter dates Charleston, Sunday morning, June 19th, in New York, Maryville, July 16, 1796. There was an extraordinary series of fires throughout the nation during the 1790s, often attributed to the slaves. This will be discussed in detail later. The Frenchman Lancourt noticed in Charleston fires of 1796 and attributes them to poor construction and the heedlessness of the Negroes. Duke de la Rochefoucauld Lancourt traveled through the United States of North America in 1795, 1796, and 1797, translates by the Neville, and general movements of erection of brick homes throughout the city followed, and the commit for the purpose of under General Thomas Pinckney chairmanship was formed by Charleston N.W. Muir on July 1st, 1796. The efforts met difficulty, one of the causes being that wood was to be believed to be the heatheners of Isaac, wielded by junior travels through the state of North America in the years 1795, 1796, 1797, and etc. And we'll stop right here. So what's revealed in chapter 4, section 1? What we could learn and go back is that there were many plots, many where the slaves have not only went and killed the oppressor, but also he has burned down his fields and his house for a period going on to the late 1700s and into the 1800s, and probably a little bit sooner than that. But one thing I want people to take note for this section, and I want people to get a clear understanding of this. In regards to how our people, ADOS people, Black Americans in America, how they dealt with oppression, you have shown that you have fought. And not only you have fought, you pay the price for your fighting. And one of the biggest things that made most of your success in regards to your revolts for the last maybe almost close to 200 years or over 100 years during the creation of America, that you have a lot of traitors amongst you. A lot of revolts were squashed and ended by others within the group. Because there's no way in hell your oppressor, or what they call the masters during that time, will find wind of any insurrection without the assistance of other traitors amongst the group of ADOS people, Black Americans. Yes, welcome again to another stream. And today we're going to continue on with this chapter, and this is titled African Negro Slave Revolts, Chapter 4, Section 2. Let us begin. In one of the numerous mob attacks against Negroes that have intermittently disgraced the United States, that in Philadelphia in 1804, and in battle, Black folks rallied in the struggles under the shout of the show Dan San Domingo. At least one of the leaders in the uprising at St. Charles and St. John the Baptist Parish in Louisiana in January 1811 was declared to be a free mulatto from Santo Domingo and named Charles Desalador and employed as a driver on the plantation of Major Andres where the rebellion commenced. Certain of the slaves involved in the Vesey conspiracy in South Carolina of 1822, they're talking about Denmark Vesey now, and counted upon aid from San Domingo, and unique in the history of America, slave revolts to this writer's knowledge from Africa, and maintaining control after an initial success in the uprising. Moreover, Vesey himself is reported to have written 2 letters to an unnamed individual or individuals, and San Domingo in connection with the plants, but their contexts were not disclosed, or their plans were not disclosed. In December 1829, slaves aboard the what they call the Lafayette boards for sale at New Orleans from Norfolk revolts, and with the intention of regaining their liberty and making their escape to Santo Domingo with the shooters, and they stated that a similar effort was to be made on board the Sakar and transported from the same place. Some of the intruders were severely wounded. They were, after considerable difficulties, stuttered, and 25 of them were bolted down to the deck until the arrival of the Vesey at New Orleans. Another and final piece of evidence of the influence of Santo Domingo exerted upon American slaves appeared in the course of correspondence between Louisiana planters and officials in Washington directly after the Turner rebellions in Virginia late in September of early in October 1831. A Mr. Nathan Morris had written to the president at the request of the number of planters inhabitants of Louisiana on the subject of their exposed situation, had reference to the insurrectionary depositions of the colored people. The command officer of the United States Army, Major General Alexander McCoon, replied, "In consequence of the representation made to the President by the Governor of Louisiana, A.B. Roman, settled for apprehension of the authorities and citizens of New Orleans as to the deposition of the colored population of the city and along the coast to raise upon the white inhabitants, and also that information had been received that the colored people in the West Indies islands had a correspondence with the black of Louisiana, tending to further their insurrectionary disposition. The Secretary of War addressed a letter to the governor in reply informing him that the Major General commands of the army would be directed to take measures for complying with the wishes of the governor. I lost no time in communicating in the officer's command and the troops at Baton Rouge to call to his aid any of the troops in the vicinity or of the Arkansas or Red Rivers. 2 companies of infantry, according to the request of the governor, are now stationed in the city. Arms are provided for the militants. As to the means proper to adopt in case of necessities, it is believed that the troops of Baton Rouge are competent to all the purpose of suppressing an attempts of the blacks. The troops, in case of need, from the Red and Arkansas River, placed at the command colony Durant a cliche. The so applied means under any contingency for seasons or for reasons which will naturally suggest themselves to you. It is desirable that the information here given may not find any way into the public print, but there is no objection to the being words illegitimate impaired of these interests for their satisfaction. And in notion, evidence of the influence of the servile rebellions in the West Indies upon American slaves, one is not to overlook the fact that the local plot and uprising were themselves continuing. It is exceedingly difficult, however, to put one finger on specific proof of this connection. Nevertheless, as well be seen, and the revolt tends to occur in bunches or periods, and it is believed that reasons for this are the infections qualities of disinfections and the great excitement it discovers occasionally that dislocation and turmoil is suppression means, and the further act of restrictions and repression that invariably follow the French Revolution itself. The philosophy is expounded and slogan liberty, equity, fraternity, expression, precision, those things of which the Negro people more than any other were deprived, and particularly the bitter perishes and widespread discussions it develops on this continent were influenced in arousing ideals of rebellion amongst the slaves. The Marcelline and Calera were sung, and newspapers were filled with reprints of revolutionary decree, passionate, and with parian to liberty, and turbulent with diminution of tyranny, and prominent Southerners addressed each other as citizens. Taylor or citizens, Randolph and French envy Gannett started his tour of the United States from Charleston, was given a hero's welcome, and that the City Democrat Club was reignition or recognized by the Jacobin Club of Paris as an affiliate branch, and the same city council, moreover, decides that his honor and esquire were aristocratic titles which should no longer matter, and journals and countrysides in the South, as elsewhere, was often embezzled with the burning engulfments of anti-revolutionists like Fisher, Ames, William L. Smith, and William Pitt, with Bernard Arnold added for good measures. In Spanish Louisiana, the turmoil was great, and the fervor of the French revolutionaries stirred up sedition among the northern French Creoles, or numerous French Creoles, and insubordination among the slaves. When in 1793 Spain declared war upon France, only severe measures and repression direction against both the whites and the Negro population prevented revolution, and that the slave in the United States itself were also aware of the implications of the French events, appearing in the fact that those involved in the Gabriel conspiracy of 1800 in Virginia had intended not to harm Frenchmen. The slaves, moreover, knew of the strained relations between the United States and France, particularly from 1797 to 1799, and this led them to hope for assistance from France once their own rebellion was well underway. Indeed, 2 white Frenchmen, never named, were declared to be directly implicated in the formation of the plot. In addition to Frenchmen, the slaves involved in the Gabriel plot had planned to exempt Methodism and Quakers from harm. The former groups had moreover been declared to be the real instigators of the plot rather than the French. Both their groups, because of their equilibrium and emancipationist leaning, had aroused considerable fear and hostility among the slaveholders. The Methodist Church, in particular, was felt to be dangerous, for that it had grown mightily in the generation following the American Revolution, and was predominantly Southern, especially strong in Virginia and North Carolina, and to a considerable extent Negroes, so that in 1796 about 20% of all Methodists were Negroes. Complaints that Methodists insist dangerous notions of equality and liberty in the minds of the slaves were frequent. You get that? At times, too, came a concrete charge that they actively develop insubordination, as, for example, in a letter from the sheriff of Culpeper County, Virginia, to the general dates September 5th, 1789. The writer declares that while the duty of the patrols was to break up meetings of slaves, they have found its performance actively and even forcibly hindered by groups of Methodists. These people are determined to encourage out Negroes to wrong, and the other day they sent to the cap of the patrols that on Friday night they would have a meeting, and they came there and offered it touch a Negro that they would protect the Negroes, and they say a word would beat them, and that's what would mean, or in other words, would. The Quakers too were the objects of bitter attacks. Thus, in May 1796, the grand jury of Chawad County in northeastern North Carolina presents that the county is reduced to a situation of great peril and danger in consequence of the proceedings of Quakers. Mind of the slaves are not only greatly corrupted and alienated from the service of their masters, but runaways are protected. Arsons are committed without a possible of discovery. It went on to remark that while the growth of anti-slavery feelings in the North and the West Indies Rebellion were also disturbing, still the Quakers and their abitur were in the offer of the common mischief. In this Quaker of the state, resolute measures of repression were needed in order to prevent that the common appeal to arms in their own defense, which is presented, appear to the almost not altogether necessary, and the Quakers replied by declaring that unrest was inherent in existence of slavery and other their creations, and conclude by urging more lieutenants, manumissions, and laws. With the thought of commercialization of slavery, however, and its strengthening grips upon the South, largely due to whitening and board inventions in cotton, 1793, and sugar, 1795, the Industrial Revolution, and the annexation of Louisiana Territory, and the intense fear caused by the many plots that occur from about 1790 to 1802, and the restrictive measures, these foster both groups made adjustment, and the Quakers solved the problem of their philosophies, inconsistencies with their surrounding social order very largely by moving away from that order. The few remain intended or tended to play down or repudiate its anti-slavery backgrounds, while the Methodists saw same problems by modifying and changing their attitudes and regulations as concerned slavery. The progressive and revolutionary movements, however, were which more than any other was considered responsible for the creation of organized expression of discontent on the part of the slave was which. And before I continue, there is a midsection, and once you get the book, you could probably catch this little small word midsection of this particular book. The slave was that which had as its aim the abolition of the practice of human enslavement itself. It is simple to find any number of statements intimating or bold affirming that the abolitionists were responsible for the slave unrest generally or for some specific plot, but it is far from simple to find substantiation for these assertions. The fashionable viewpoints of the slave crazy was expressed in the Senate of the United States January 10th, 1861 by Jefferson Davis, declared that the speculation as to whether our servants would rebel or not exceedingly offense. He went on to assert government have tampered with slaves, bad men have gone among the arrogant and credulous people and incite them to murder and arson, but of themselves, moving by themselves, I say history does not chronicle a case of Negro insurrection or concocted Negro insurrection. Several years early, a committee of the Senate of South Carolina had similarly remarks in connection with Negroes. The animal predominantly large over the intellect being, he had no aspirations for liberty and would never dream of revolt or of evaluating his social status, but for the machination of those who professionally themselves his friend are in fact his worst enemy. Unfortunately for him, these machinations have been in some instances to a certain extent successful. A leading authority on the history of the American Negro, Carter G. Woodson, while making by no means so sweeping a statement as Jefferson Davis curiously associate, thus said that being about 1830 when intellectual Negroes made so many attempts to organize Seville insurrections, they were encouraged by abolitionists, specific insurrections, and plus were often directly ascribed to the same source. Thus, one writer asserts, and lets it go at that, the Denmark Vesey and some of his comrades in conspiracy had visited the North and had been infected by the propaganda of the abolitionists. Any number of contemporary of later commentary on the Turner rebellions had maintained that abolitionist propaganda was responsible for its occurrence. This was the opinion of Virginia Governor John Floyd, which he expressed briefly in his message to the legislature on December 6, 1831, and in detail in the letter in the governor of South Carolina. Now, mind you, Nat Turner was killed November 20 or something of that same year before they came the next month with this. Here it appears that when Floyd accused abolitionists in his legislative message, he was using the words in a very broad sense to include all people who definitely opposed slavery and desired its speedy demise, and not especially following of any particular school of anti-slavery thought. Governor Floyd wrote, and I'm gonna use my voice. Oh, you enjoyed the series? Thanks, bro. Let's continue. I will notice that affairs in my annual message, but shall only give a very careless history of it as it appears to the public. I am fully persuading the spirit of insubordination which has and still manifests itself in Virginia had it origin among an eminent sect from the Yankee population upon their first arrival amongst us, the most especially the Yankee peddlers and traders. The course has been by no means a direct one. They began first by making them religious ere conversation, whereof that characterized telling the black God was no respecter of person, and that black man was as good as the whites, that all men were born free and equal, that they cannot serve two masters, that is the white people rebelling against England to obtain freedom, so have the blacks and rights to do. Now mind you, they didn't attain freedom just by those. They had help with Negroes during the First Revolutionary War. Don't be fooled by that. Remember that. He added that the local white ministers and religious ladies taught the Negroes how to read so that the Bible wonders might be open to them. But the slave, he asserted, read the production of David Walker and William Lloyd Garrison as well, and this together with the urging of the Negro preacher produced by Turner's Rebellion. Now, mind you, it was never the Caucasoid, what they call the white man, taught the so-called Negro male to read. It was his so-called female, his white counterpart female, taught the Negro male to read. Now, we all know that the only person that was able to read without any problem during that time was the Negro female or Negro woman. So keep in mind that the only people that was teaching people to read was that white female teaching the black man and black woman to read. Just a little side note. Miss Lawrence Lewis, a niece of George Washington, in a letter dated Alexandria, Virginia, October 17, 1831, told her friends Harrison Gray, Otis, and Mayor of Boston that none of the editors of the Liberators, we owe in greatest measures this calamity. Again, W. Gilmore Sims, in review a book by Harriet Maritoon, indicted his beliefs that actually mudground organization or organizational and aggregational works on the part of the abolitionists, because the uprising, he quote in part and not quote correctly a statement by Mass Maturel to the effects that the revolt happens before the abolitionist movement began objecting to this, and declaring our author's confound case with effects she should have said that the Southampton insurrection broke out before the secret workings of the abolitionists had been generally detected or suspected. Albert Bushnell and Hart felt that the Walker pamphlets may possibly have influenced Turner. That very guarded statement is cited by Harriet A. Hubert and substantiate his definite and unqualified assertions. The northern aggregations were responsible for the revolts. It is possible that Professor Hart made his statement are the basis of the opinion of Benjamin Landy, who believed that Nat Turner had probably seen the pamphlets and thought it's probably that the conspiracy that the Turner and those who immediately follow were instigated chiefly by the aberration pamphlets of David Walker, if in fact they owed their origins to any publications. Whoever several later writers had adopted the attitude of Hubert and Hart. Other fewer deny that there is a discretionary, any constitutive connection between the agitations and the outbreaks of the revolts. First in this group by William Lloyd Garrison himself, who presently and truthfully denied having advised the Negro and was forced and declared he not a single white or black subscriber south of the Potomac, as James Floyd Rhodes Amplified put it, assertion that slavery is a damning crime in one thing, and the actual incidence of slaves to insurrection is another. One may, of course, safely say that Walker's pamphlets possibly influenced Turner. It is also possible that some works on Napoleon's influenced him, and he decided that I was obtained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty. There is as much evidence for one as for the other. The fact is that never had there been presented and loaded at clear evidence going to show a causal relations between any anti-slavery literature and Turner's action. Both were, of course, characterized of the spirit of the times and possessed a kinship of origins, barreling or hatred of the slavery, but no other relationship have been demonstrated. Okay. A somewhat similar stated of affair prevailed concerning the widespread conspiracies of 1835. Southern newspapers and letters written were free and easy with generalized accusations, and it hurled against the abolitionists as the originator and prime moves of the troubles, and in case of charge was dignified by the replace or repeat by the President of the United States. Part of Andrew Jackson's 70 annual message read as the following. I must also invite your attention in the painful excitement produced in the South by attempts to circulate through the mail inflammatory appeal address to the passion of the slave in print and in various sorts of publications calculated to stimulate them to insurrection and to produce all the horrors of several wars. It is fortunate for the country that the good sense of generosity, feeling, and the deep notes or the deep roots attachments of the people of the North or non-slaveholder states to be Union and to their fellow citizens of the same blood in the South have gone so strong and pressed and towards to the settlement entertaining against the proceedings of the misguided person who have engaged in those unconstitutional and wily attempts, and especially against the missionaries from foreign parts who have dared to interfere in the matters as to authorize the hopes that those attempts will no longer be persistent in. And these contemporary charges have been retracted by some later writers, but again it must be stated that while it is clear whites were involved in these 1835 plots of non-proof, indeed no good evidence is known to exist tying up the abolitionist movement of any whole-footed members of that movement with these conspiracies. It is to the point to note that the governor of Mississippi itself, in that proclamation, calls upon all citizens and state officers to aid in suppressing the insurrectionary movements disputing the states, did not refer to the suspect whites and abolitionists. Rather, he called them, and in some case, in his particular plot, accurately called them lawlessness, base, villainous white men. The abolitionists themselves deny any part in the plot. The remarks of Angelica E. Grinkett made in her famous appeal to the Christian women in South may be referred to as an apt summary of their views. She declared that she knew the material mailed to prominently white people in the South by the Americans. Anti-slavery societies contained no appeal to the slave, to whom they were not sent. The rebellion, moreover, with regards to those white men who it was or said did try to raise an insurrection in Mississippi a year ago and who were stated to be abolitionists, none of them were ever proven to be members of the anti-slavery society, and it must remain a matter of great doubt whether even they were guilty of the crime alleged against them, because when any community is thrown into such a panic as to inflict lynch law upon accused persons, they cannot be supposed to be capable of judging with calmness and impartiality. That paragraph is admirable attempt of evidence concerning this subject. Later outbreaks were also specifically attributed to the direct interference of abolitionists. That was true especially of the vast distribution of 1856 and 1886. In September 1856, Northern incendiaries were blamed for unrest in Clark County, Mississippi, and in Eben, Florida. In both places, the accused were forced to flee for their lives. Later this year, a man described as an Ohio abolitionist named Davidson was declared to be implicated in a several plot in Lavater County, Texas, and suffered 100 lashes. A Southern newspaper in Barter lately, early in 1857, when the unrest appeared to have passed its peak, felt that the phenomena was due to the machination of Northern suitors, while the British consul in Richmond, a popular novelist, G.P.R. James, believed that wide diffusion of the disorder and the implications of whites indicate that the movement had been planned in North. As the final instance of this viewpoint may be mentioned in a letter from Charles Demock Serpentine of Richmond Army to the governor of Virginia. He made a considerable length suggestion for strengthening the military prowess of the state and asked pardon for his seemingly off-conscious of the ground of the great dangerous arising from the slave population. His concern was heightened and said the official, "When I regret the hellish design of those who are work upon the passion and arrogance of our slave, stimulated them to deeds of horror abortive, and they must be for good to any." The year 1860 almost exactly parallelly a concern troubles with slaves that of 1856. and once again abolitionists were held largely responsible. Yet here is a before the investigators is forced to conclude that evidence of this complexity or of the character and political philosophies affiliations of the whites involved are fair from satisfactory. Again, many Southern publications range with the familiar charge against Northern incendiaries and abolitionists, and particularly favored by the politicians, Black Republicans, and the later are well exemplified by the remarks of the influence senators from Texas, Louis T. Wingfold, declaring that Abraham Lincoln himself was a professional abolitionist, organized, and agitator. The senator went on to warn, "We say to these states in the North that you shall not permit men to go there and excite your citizens to make John Brown raid or bring fire and styrene within these limits of the state, to which I owe my allegiance. You shall not publish newspapers and pamphlets to excite our slaves to insurrection. We will have peace, or withdraw from the Union," becoming more specific in his charge, but unfortunately not in the proof. The senator told of the many towns and cities that said he had been destroyed by the slave-created fires, and to quantify or qualities of poisons found among the Negroes, and then in a most interesting passage states an association called the Mystic Red was entered into the members of the Methodist Church North and to John Brown's men, and their purpose was to carry out the irresponsible conflict to harm our towns, burn up the stores and our merchants, burn up the mills, to bring free soil northern capitals in, and thus get possession of Texas. Once again, the implications organization denied the truth of this accusation. One who personally and whose party generally had been and was again to be accused, while not dignified the charges against himself by noting them, did as the leaders of the Republican Party of disavow any connection between the organizations and the slave conspiracies, and deemed that it desires to see the forming or the maturing of such conspiracies. And that's the end of chapter 4, sections 1 and 2. Now, in closing, more plots, rebellions, and even including John Brown's, his involvement into these slave revolts, which we all know about John Brown. I don't take notice or care about John Brown, because he is one of them dudes that had an agenda like every other person during that time, to want not just a free Negro, but to get some more of a foothold in this country per se. But like I said, with all these revolts and plots that's going on during late 1700s and on the 1800s, a lot of things, the system with the planters, the governors, even the presidency, had to keep watch of this American Negro. For reasons because he had that potential to not only build America, but also, take back what is rightfully his and his freedom. So I don't think I have anything else to say. As I look through the comments. Well, on that note, I think I will conclude here. I'd like to thank everybody for watching into tonight's stream. Be on the lookout for the next reading, which is chapter 5, section 1. So until next time, take care now.